At 9:38 on the morning of July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy turned black. 600 American fighter bombers screamed down from the clouds and began tearing apart a narrow strip of French hedgerow country west of the town of St. Lô. The explosions came so fast they merged into a single, continuous roar that shook the earth for miles in every direction. Windows shattered in villages kilometers away. French civilians in distant farmhouses felt the ground tremble beneath their feet and crossed themselves, praying for the souls of whoever was beneath those bombs. German soldiers looked up from their foxholes and saw something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The aircraft seemed endless, wave after wave descending from the heavens like avenging angels. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front, who had stood against Soviet human wave attacks and massed armor, found themselves frozen with a terror they had never experienced before. Minutes later, 1,500 heavy bombers appeared on the horizon. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators stretched across the sky in formations so vast they blocked out the sun. The drone of their engines grew into a thunder that drowned out all other sound. Men pressed their hands over their ears, but nothing could keep out that terrible noise. It was the sound of industrial civilization turned to the single purpose of destruction. And then the bombs began to fall. Nearly 5,000 tons of bombs rained down on a rectangle of Norman countryside, measuring roughly 7,000 yards long and 2,500 yards deep. High explosives, napalm, white phosphorus, and fragmentation bombs fell in overlapping carpets of destruction. The ground heaved and buckled like a living thing in agony. Trees that had stood for centuries were torn from the earth and flung through the air like matchsticks. Stone farmhouses that had witnessed generations of Norman life simply ceased to exist in flashes of fire and smoke. Men were buried alive in their trenches, clawing desperately at the dirt that entombed them. Others were thrown dozens of meters by the concussion waves, their bodies broken before they hit the ground. The very atmosphere seemed to ignite. Simultaneously, more than 1,000 American artillery pieces opened fire. Howitzers and heavy guns poured an allocated 167,000 rounds into the same narrow strip of earth that the bombers were devastating. The shells arrived in coordinated waves through the American system of time on target fire missions, ensuring that rounds fired from different batteries at different distances arrived at the same moment for maximum shock effect. There was no rhythm to the explosions that a man could anticipate. There was only continuous, random destruction. On the ground below this apocalypse stood the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most elite armored formations in the entire German military. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were instructors, the men who trained other men to fight. They had been handpicked from tank schools and infantry academies across the Reich for their skill and experience. They were the best Germany had to offer. Within hours, this proud unit would be reduced to shattered wreckage and broken men. Its commander would tell his superiors that only the dead could now hold the line. And the German defense of Normandy would crack wide open, leading directly to the liberation of France and the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. This is the story of the most devastating bombardment of World War II. It is the story of how American firepower broke not just German defensive positions, but the minds and spirits of the soldiers defending them. It is a story that reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of modern warfare and the limits of what human beings can endure. The Panzer Lehr Division was no ordinary German unit. Its very name revealed its special status. Lehr meant demonstration or instruction in German. This was originally a training formation, assembled from the best tank crews and infantry instructors in the entire Wehrmacht. Every soldier in Panzer Lehr had been hand-picked for his experience and expertise. These were the men who taught others how to fight. They demonstrated tactics and techniques at military schools across occupied Europe. They were expected to embody German military excellence in its purest form. The division was assembled in late December 1943 and organized under the command of Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein in January 1940. 4. The timing was significant. By early 1944, German military planners knew that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was inevitable. The question was not whether the invasion would come, but where and when. Would it be Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing from England? Would it be Norway, to threaten Germany's access to Swedish iron ore? Or would it be Normandy, despite the longer sea crossing and more difficult beaches? Panzer Lehr was created specifically to serve as a rapid reaction force, a mobile reserve that could rush to meet any Allied landing and throw it back into the sea before a beachhead could be established. Bayerlein was himself a legend among German armor officers. Born in 1899 in Würzburg, Bavaria, he had served as an enlisted infantryman in World War I, experiencing the brutal trench warfare of the Western Front before Germany's defeat. After the war, he had joined the new Reichswehr, earned his officer's commission, and transferred to the emerging Panzer Arm in the 1930s. Recognizing that armored warfare represented the future of military operations, his career had taken him from the lightning conquest of Poland in 1939 to the fall of France in 1940 to the invasion of Russia in 1941, where he served with Guderian's Panzer Group II during Operation Barbarossa. Later that year, he was transferred to North Africa. It was in the desert that Bayerlein made his reputation. In North Africa, Bayerlein had served as Chief of Staff of the Afrika Korps, fighting alongside the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. He had stood beside Rommel during the capture of Tobruk in June 1942, one of Germany's greatest victories in Africa. He had helped plan the offensives at Gazala and the drives toward Egypt that brought the Afrika Korps to within 60 miles of Alexandria. When Rommel's army-level Chief of Staff was wounded and Corps Commander captured on the same day in May 1942, Bayerlein had stepped up to serve at the army level. He had been present at El Alamein when the tide finally turned against the German forces, and he had helped manage the long fighting retreat that followed. When Rommel was wounded by an Allied air attack on July 17, 1944, just 8 days before Operation Cobra, Bayerlein had already proven himself one of the most experienced and capable panzer commanders in the German army. His knowledge of armoured warfare was comprehensive, gained through years of study and combat in conditions ranging from the frozen steppes of the East to the burning sands of Libya. His men respected him. His superiors trusted him. He was exactly the kind of officer that Germany needed in its hour of crisis. Panzer Lehr was equipped with the finest weapons Germany could produce in 1944. Its tank battalions fielded both the reliable Panzer IV medium tank and the fearsome Panther. The Panzer IV had been the workhorse of German armoured forces since the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, a versatile and dependable vehicle that could fulfill almost any battlefield role. Its 75mm gun could defeat most Allied tanks at reasonable combat ranges, and its armour, while not heavy, provided adequate protection against most infantry weapons. The Panther was newer and more powerful, arguably the best all-around tank of the entire war. With frontal armour thick enough to defeat American Sherman tanks at virtually any range, a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate Allied armour at distances exceeding a kilometre, and good cross-country mobility despite its 45-ton weight, the Panther represented German tank design at its finest. The division's Panzer Grenadier regiments, the 901st and 902nd, were mechanized infantry of the highest quality. Unlike ordinary German infantry who marched on foot or rode in trucks, the Panzer Grenadiers of Panzer Lehr rode into battle in StKFZ 251 armoured half-tracks. These vehicles could keep pace with the tanks over rough terrain and provided protection against small arms, fire and shell fragments. The soldiers inside them were trained to fight, mounted or dismounted, depending on the tactical situation, providing the infantry support that tanks needed to survive in close country. Panzer Artillery Regiment 130 provided the division with organic fire support. Its batteries were equipped with self-propelled guns and towed howitzers, all fully motorized to keep pace with armored operations. The gunners were experienced professionals who had learned their trade in actual combat, able to deliver accurate fire within minutes of receiving a call for support. Supporting units included Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 130, equipped with armoured cars and half-tracks for scouting operations, as well as engineer, signal, and supply units. Every element of the division was mechanized or motorized. Nothing moved on foot unless it had to. On paper, Panzer Lehr was the perfect instrument of mobile warfare, capable of concentrating rapidly at a decisive point and delivering overwhelming combat power against any enemy. But by late July 1944, Panzer Lehr existed on paper only. The division had been fighting without rest since June 6th, thrown into the desperate effort to contain the Allied beachheads immediately after the D-Day landings. 7 weeks of continuous combat in the murderous Norman hedgerows had ground it down to a shadow of its former strength. The thick bocage country had proven a nightmare for tank operations. The Norman hedgerows were not simple fences or shrubbery like those found elsewhere in Europe. They were ancient agricultural boundaries, dating back to medieval times. Earthen embankments, sometimes a metre thick and 2 metres high, topped with dense vegetation that had been growing for centuries. The roots of trees and bushes intertwined with the earth to create obstacles that could stop a 30-ton tank cold. Each field in the bocage was a natural fortress. German infantry dug into the embankments and created interlocking fields of fire that turned every hedgerow into a killing ground. A machine gun team positioned in one corner of a field could cover the entire space with fire, while remaining invisible to approaching enemies. Mortar positions behind the hedgerows could drop shells on attackers without exposing themselves. Anti-tank guns could be positioned to cover the few gaps where vehicles could pass. When American tanks tried to crash through the hedges, they exposed their thin belly armor as they climbed the embankments, making them easy targets for German anti-tank weapons and Panzerfaust rockets. When American infantry tried to advance without tank support, they were cut down by machine guns firing from concealed positions. Every field became a separate battle. Every hedgerow had to be taken by assault. Progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. The German defenders held every advantage in this terrain. They knew the ground intimately after weeks of preparation. They had carefully prepared their positions with overlapping fields of fire and pre-registered mortar targets. They could see the Americans coming while remaining hidden themselves. And when American forces finally captured one field at heavy cost in lives and time, they found themselves facing another hedgerow, another fortress, another killing ground identical to the last. Allied air power, which should have given the Americans decisive advantages, was partially neutralized by the bocage. Fighter bombers struggled to identify targets among the dense vegetation. Observation aircraft could not see German positions concealed beneath the hedgerows. The open warfare that American commanders had trained for in England and North Africa was impossible in this close, complex country. By July 25, Panzer Lehr had been reduced to approximately 2,200 combat troops, less than a quarter of its authorized strength of over 14,000 men. Its tank strength had collapsed to just 12 operational Panzer IVs and 16 Panthers. Roughly 30 more tanks sat in rear repair shops, their crews working around the clock to keep them running with dwindling spare parts and limited facilities. Many of those tanks would never return to service. The Panzer Grenadier regiments had lost most of their experienced, non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals who formed the backbone of any German infantry unit. These men could not be easily replaced. Their expertise had been accumulated over years of training and combat. They knew how to read terrain, how to position weapons, how to keep young soldiers calm under fire. The replacements who arrived were often poorly trained conscripts, unfamiliar with the brutal realities of hedgerow fighting and the complex tactics required to survive in the bocage. General Bayerlein himself was exhausted. 7 weeks of constant stress, inadequate sleep, and the ever-present threat of death from the air had worn down even his iron constitution. Every day brought new crises. Every night brought raids and harassing fire. His operations officer, Major Kurt Kaufmann, would later describe him as nervous and weak by this point in the campaign. The Desert Fox's former chief of staff had reached the limits of human endurance, yet Bayerlein and his men continued to hold the line. They held because they were professionals who had trained their entire careers for this moment. They held because the alternative, the collapse of the Western Front and the invasion of Germany itself, was unthinkable. And they held because they believed, despite everything, that the German army could still somehow prevail. They did not know that the Americans had already decided their fate. A plan was in motion that would change everything. The situation in Normandy by late July 1944 had become a source of growing frustration for Allied commanders. The D-Day landings on June 6 had secured a foothold on the European continent, the greatest amphibious operation in history successfully completed. But the expected rapid breakout from the beachheads had failed to materialize. American forces in particular found themselves trapped in the hedgerow country of the Cotentin Peninsula, fighting a brutal war of attrition that seemed to favor the defenders in every engagement. The bocage was unlike any terrain American soldiers had trained to fight in during their preparation in England. Military planners had expected that once the beaches were secured, Allied forces would sweep inland across relatively open country, similar to the plains of France where the decisive battles of World War I had been fought. Instead, they encountered a maze of hedgerows that negated American advantages in mobility and firepower. Each field had to be taken separately, at heavy cost in lives and time. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, knew that something fundamental had to change. The war could not be won by bleeding American divisions white in the hedgerows. Casualty rates were mounting steadily, while territorial gains remained minimal. Replacements were arriving faster than they could be absorbed and trained for this unique form of combat. Morale was suffering as men realized that tomorrow would bring the same brutal fighting as today, with no end in sight. Bradley needed a breakout, a concentrated blow that would shatter the German defensive crust once and for all, allowing American armor to pour into the open country beyond. He needed to escape the bocage and reach terrain where American advantages in mobility, logistics, and especially air power could be brought to bear. He needed Operation Cobra. The concept was developed by Bradley and his staff in early July. He presented the plan to Montgomery on July 10th, who approved it, and briefed his corps commanders on July 12th. Eisenhower's crucial contribution was securing the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force for ground support, a decision that required overruling objections from strategic bombing advocates. The plan was simple in concept but unprecedented in scale. American forces would concentrate overwhelming firepower on a deliberately narrow front, obliterating the German defenders in a target zone just west of St. Lo. Infantry would then advance through the devastation and open a gap for armored divisions to exploit. The tanks would do what tanks were designed to do: drive deep into enemy territory, disrupting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, spreading chaos. The key to success was the bombardment itself. Previous American offensives had been supported by artillery barrages and fighter-bomber attacks, but nothing on the scale Bradley now envisioned. He wanted to deliver such crushing firepower that German resistance would simply cease to exist. Not weakened, not disrupted, but completely annihilated. The target zone was deliberately small, concentration being essential to the concept. Bradley selected a rectangle measuring 7,000 yards along the Saint-Lô to Perrier's Road and extending 2,500 yards deep into German lines. This narrow concentration would ensure that every square meter of the target zone received devastating punishment. There would be no place to hide within that rectangle, no shelter from the storm, no foxhole deep enough to protect its occupants. The bombardment would be delivered in carefully coordinated waves, designed to maximize both physical destruction and psychological shock. First, fighter bombers would strike German strongpoints along a 300-yard strip marking the front edge of the target zone. This would suppress German anti-aircraft defenses and mark the boundary between American and German lines with smoke and fire, providing visual references for the heavy bombers that would follow. Then the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force, the same formations that had been systematically destroying German industry and transportation, would carpet bomb the entire rectangle with high explosives and incendiary bombs. Medium bombers of the 9th Air Force would add their contribution to the destruction. And throughout it all, more than 1,000 American artillery pieces would pour their allocated rounds into German positions. The statistics were staggering to contemplate. Nearly 3,000 aircraft would participate in the bombardment. Over 4,000 tons of bombs would be dropped on an area smaller than many American farms. 167,000 artillery rounds would be fired into the same narrow strip of earth. The concentration of firepower would exceed anything previously achieved in the history of warfare. It would be the greatest storm of steel and fire that human beings had ever unleashed upon other human beings. And the men of Panzer Lehr were standing directly in its path. The morning of July 25, 1944, began much like any other day for the soldiers of Panzer Lehr. The Norman summer was warm and humid, the kind of weather that made men sweat in their uniforms and dream of cooler places. Fog clung to the low ground in the early hours, slowly burning off as the sun rose over the hedgerows. Birds sang in the trees, oblivious to the death that lurked beneath them. In foxholes and bunkers scattered across the division's sector, exhausted men went about the grim routines of life on the front line. Some cleaned their weapons, a task that was never truly finished in the dusty hedgerow country, where dirt and grime worked their way into every mechanism. Others tried to catch what sleep they could, knowing that any moment might bring an American attack or an artillery barrage. A few lucky ones heated ersatz coffee over small fires, carefully shielded to avoid attracting the attention of American observation aircraft that seemed to hover constantly over the front lines. Letters from home were read and reread until the paper began to fall apart. General Bayerlein had established his command post in a farmhouse near the village of Dangi. He had chosen the location for its relative concealment from American aircraft, though he knew that no position in Normandy was truly safe from Allied air power. The Allies had achieved complete air superiority over the battlefield weeks before. German aircraft rarely appeared, and when they did, they were quickly driven off or destroyed. The sky belonged to the enemy. His staff officers worked to maintain communications with the scattered elements of his division, a task made increasingly difficult by constant artillery fire that cut telephone lines almost as fast as signalmen could repair them. Radio communications were possible but risky. The Americans had excellent direction-finding equipment and would target any radio transmitter they detected. The safest communication was no communication at all. The men of Panzer Lehr knew they were facing another day of survival. The Americans had been attacking repeatedly since D-Day, probing for weaknesses, wearing down German defenses through attrition. Today would bring more of the same, or so they believed. Weather had delayed the operation for 24 hours. A preliminary bombardment on July 24 had been partially aborted due to poor visibility, but not before some bombs fell short and killed 25 American soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division. Troops of the 120th Infantry Regiment, caught in the errant bombing, had opened fire on their own aircraft in rage and desperation. The friendly fire incident had raised serious concerns about the bombing approach, but the commanders decided the operation could not be delayed further. On the morning of July 25, the weather cleared. Reconnaissance aircraft reported good visibility over the target zone. Bradley gave the order to proceed. The moment had come. At 9:38, the first wave struck with terrible precision. 600 P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs swept down on the forward edge of the target zone. Their 500-pound bombs and rockets tore into German positions along a narrow strip, marking the boundary between American and German lines. Machine gun fire raked trenches and foxholes. Napalm, the jellied gasoline that American aircraft had begun using in recent months, created walls of fire that consumed everything they touched, men and equipment alike. Smoke and dust rose into the sky, forming markers for the bombers that followed. The fighter pilots pulled away, their work done, climbing back to altitude to watch what would come next. Now the heavy bombers would finish the job. Then came the heavens' true wrath. 1,500 B, 17 flying fortresses, and B-24 liberators appeared from the north, flying in formation at altitudes between 12,000 and 15,000 feet. The formations seemed endless, wave after wave of heavy bombers stretching across the horizon in every direction. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had faced Soviet artillery barrages and tank assaults, looked up in disbelief. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for what they were about to witness. The first bombs began falling at approximately 10 o'clock. Each heavy bomber carried between 4,000 and 8,000 pounds of explosives. They released their loads in a carefully choreographed sequence designed to ensure complete coverage of the target zone. The bombs fell in carpets, overlapping patterns that left no ground untouched. From above, the target zone disappeared beneath a continuous rippling of explosions, smoke, and fire. General Bayerlein had positioned himself near the front when the bombardment began. He would later describe the experience in testimony given after his capture to American intelligence officers. His words paint a picture of hell on earth. The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, he said. Back and forth the carpets were laid. Artillery positions were wiped out. Tanks were overturned and buried. Infantry positions were flattened. All roads and tracks were destroyed. By midday, the entire area resembled a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. The concussion waves from the explosions were powerful enough to kill men who suffered no visible wounds. Medical science would later understand this as blast lung, internal injuries caused by pressure waves that ruptured blood vessels and collapsed airways. Those who survived the blasts found themselves unable to breathe, as the air itself seemed to be sucked away by the explosions. The noise was beyond description, a continuous rolling thunder that penetrated to the bones and overwhelmed all senses. Men could not hear, could not think, and could barely remember their own names. Several of my men went mad, Bayerlein testified. They rushed round in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Simultaneously with the storm from the air, innumerable guns of American artillery pounded drumfire into our positions. The term drumfire was not metaphorical. It referred to a type of sustained artillery bombardment, so intense that individual explosions merged into a continuous roar like the beating of a great drum. More than 1,000 artillery pieces were firing into the target zone, ranging from 105mm light howitzers to massive 240mm heavy guns. Their shells arrived in overlapping waves, denying the defenders any moment of respite in which to catch their breath or gather their thoughts. All signal communications had been cut, and no command was possible, Bayerlein reported. The shock effect on the troops was indescribable. Over 70% of my soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed, he said. The survivors behaved like lunatics and could not be deployed. In my opinion, hell is not as bad as what we experienced. The bombardment lasted approximately 1 hour. 60 minutes of continuous destruction that transformed a section of Norman countryside into something resembling the surface of the moon. When it finally ended, an eerie silence fell over the target zone. The silence of the dead and the dying, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the crackling of fires that still burned in the wreckage. When American infantry began their advance at 11 o'clock, they entered a landscape beyond recognition. The hedgerows that had cost so much blood to capture in previous weeks had simply been erased. Where there had been fields and farms, there were now only craters. The craters overlapped and merged, some of them large enough to swallow a tank. Shattered trees jutted from the torn earth like broken bones. The smell of high explosives mixed with the stench of burned flesh and churned earth to create an odor that survivors would remember for decades. The advancing Americans found German soldiers in every state of destruction. Some had been killed instantly by direct hits, their bodies torn apart by the blasts. Others had been buried alive in collapsed trenches, suffocated before they could dig themselves out. Still others wandered in a daze, their eyes vacant, unable to comprehend what had happened or respond to commands in any language. They had the 1,000-yard stare that men developed when their minds could no longer process the horrors they had witnessed. A great number of the men were in a daze for a while, one American after-action report noted. They were just staring blankly and unable to understand when spoken to. This description, remarkably, referred to American troops caught in the short bombing that had struck their own lines. The effect on German defenders at the center of the target zone was far worse. German prisoners taken on July 25 told their captors they were still shocked by the power of the bombing. Many simply surrendered when American soldiers approached, lacking the will or the mental clarity to resist. Others did not surrender so much as fail to react at all. They sat in their destroyed positions and waited to be captured, unable to muster any response. Bayerlein attempted to rally what remained of his division. Communications had been completely destroyed. No telephones worked. Radios had been smashed or their operators killed. He had to rely on runners, the ancient method of military communication dating back to the wars of ancient Greece, to contact his scattered units. Many of those runners never returned, lost in the cratered moonscape, or killed by continuing American attacks. The first day's results appeared modest on American situation maps. The 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins advanced only about 2,000 meters. Isolated strongpoints still resisted with desperate ferocity. A handful of surviving Panther tanks and 88mm guns held up American columns for hours, their crews fighting with the stubborn professionalism that characterized the German army even in its death throes. But appearances were deceiving. The German defensive system had been shattered in ways that would only become apparent over the following days. Communications were gone. Command and control had collapsed. Units that had not been directly hit by the bombardment found themselves isolated, cut off from orders, supplies, and any understanding of the larger situation. The 5th Parachute Division on the western edge of the bombardment zone had escaped largely intact, but it was now an island in a sea of destruction. Collins made a decision that would prove decisive for the entire campaign. On the afternoon of July 25, recognizing that the German command structure had been broken even where individual units still fought, he ordered his armored exploitation force to move forward ahead of schedule. The original plan called for infantry to secure the breach before armor poured through. Collins judged that waiting would allow the Germans to recover. He was right. The 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 3rd Armored Division began moving forward on the morning of July 26. They found that resistance, while fierce in places, was uncoordinated. German units fought individual battles without any larger plan or mutual support. American tanks bypassed strongpoints that infantry would reduce later. The war of movement had finally begun. The collapse accelerated with terrifying speed. By July 26, the German 7th Army reported 7 major ruptures in its defensive line. Units found themselves outflanked before they even knew they were in danger. Communication delays meant that commanders were reacting to situations that no longer existed, issuing orders for positions that had already been overrun. The 352nd Infantry Division, the same formation that had defended Omaha Beach on D-Day with such stubborn courage, was now reduced to roughly 650 battle-exhausted troops. It was swept aside by American armor advancing through the wreckage. The 353rd Infantry Division, committed from Corps Reserve, was destroyed piece by piece as it arrived at the battlefield. Field Marshal von Kluge, commanding German forces in the west, sent an officer to Bayerlein's headquarters with orders that not a single man was to leave his position. The German High Command still believed that willpower could substitute for destroyed units and shattered communications. Bayerlein's response has become one of the most quoted passages in the history of the Normandy campaign. "Out in front, everyone is holding out," Bayerlein told the officer. "Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews, they are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. Not one. They are lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they are dead. Dead. You may report to the Field Marshal that the Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated. Only the dead can now hold the line." The bombardment's destructive power came with a tragic irony. Americans died in significant numbers from their own weapons. The heavy bombers had approached the target zone perpendicular to the front line rather than parallel, despite Bradley's explicit instructions. This approach path increased the risk of bombs falling short into American positions. Smoke and dust from earlier bombing runs drifted northward into American lines, obscuring visual references for bombardiers trying to identify their targets. On July 24, the partial bombardment had killed 25 Americans and wounded 131, mostly from the 30th Infantry Division. On July 25, 111 Americans were killed and 490 wounded by friendly bombs. The 30th Division again bore the brunt of the casualties, suffering 64 killed, 374 wounded, 60 missing, and 164 evacuated with combat exhaustion. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, and the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre. McNair had been observing the bombardment from a slit trench with the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment. A bomb landed directly on his position. His body was hurled 60 feet through the air. Medics could identify him only by the 3 stars on his collar. The man who had been responsible for training the entire American ground army had been killed by that army's own weapons. His death was kept secret for weeks to deny the Germans any propaganda victory. War correspondent Ernie Pyle was caught in the same errant bombing. The journalist who had done more than any other writer to bring the experience of the common American soldier to the public found himself face down in a Norman ditch, praying for survival as American bombs exploded around him. He called it the most sustained, horrible thing I have ever gone through. Pyle would survive Normandy only to die from Japanese machine gun fire on Iwo the following year. A doctor treating American casualties noticed with grim fascination that the faces of the dead were still pink. They had been killed by the concussion waves, their lungs and internal organs ruptured by the pressure, rather than by shrapnel. If this was the effect on Americans at the periphery of the bombardment, the conditions at the center of the target zone defied human comprehension. General Eisenhower, informed of the friendly fire casualties, declared that he would never again use heavy bombers for ground support. He later relented under operational necessity, but the declaration reflected the profound shock felt throughout the American command structure at what had happened. The destruction of Panzer Lehr is documented with unusual completeness, because Bayerlein survived the war and was extensively interrogated by American intelligence officers. The key document is a 52-page transcript of interviews conducted by Major Kenneth W. Heckler at Bad Nauheim in August 1945. This transcript provides a detailed account of the division's final hours as a functioning military formation. According to Bayerlein's post-war testimony, his division suffered approximately 950 casualties on July 24 and 25 combined. His reported monthly totals for July reached 347 killed, 1,144 wounded, and 1,480 missing. The majority of the missing were attributed to the carpet bombings. Stunned survivors were simply captured when American infantry advanced through their positions. They offered no resistance because they were incapable of resistance. Bayerlein broke down his reported casualties by corps. Approximately 50% resulted from bombing, 30% from artillery, and 20% from other weapons. 3 battalion command posts were destroyed outright. At least 14 assault guns and 10 tanks were knocked out. Most of the division's vehicles and communications equipment were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Beyond the physical destruction, Bayerlein's testimony reveals the psychological devastation inflicted on his men. Soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had fought the British in North Africa, who had held the line in Normandy for 7 brutal weeks, simply broke under the bombardment. Men who had faced death countless times found themselves paralyzed with terror they had never experienced before. The fundamental social bonds that held military units together dissolved in that hour of helpless suffering. The trust between soldiers, the confidence in their leaders, the belief that skill and courage could influence their fate, all of it was destroyed by forces beyond any individual's control. No amount of training could prepare a soldier for such an experience. No courage could stand against such overwhelming force. The human mind has limits, and those limits were exceeded on July 25. The immediate aftermath of Operation Cobra transformed the strategic situation across Western Europe. By the night of July 27, officers of the 30th Infantry Division reported that this thing has busted wide open. Field Marshal von Kluge told his chief of staff that it was a madhouse. The Americans have ripped open the whole Western Front. The statistics told the story of catastrophe for Germany. In the last 6 days of July, First Army captured 20,000 German prisoners. The 8th Corps alone took more than 7,000 prisoners between July 28 and 31, while suffering fewer than 700 casualties. The exchange ratio had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. The 2nd Armored Division destroyed 64 German tanks and 538 vehicles, while inflicting over 7,370 casualties. During the exploitation phase, the 4th Armored Division advanced 25 miles in 36 hours to capture Avranches, the gateway to Brittany, and the open country beyond the hedgerows of Normandy. On August 1st, General George S. Patton's Third Army became operational and poured through the breach that Cobra had created. The flamboyant general finally had the mobile warfare he had trained his entire career to wage. His tanks raced across France, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, spreading chaos throughout the German rear areas. German units that had not been in the target zone found themselves outflanked and cut off as American armor swept around them. Formations that tried to retreat were caught on the roads by American fighter bombers that now had clear targets. The orderly defensive lines of late July dissolved into chaos as commanders lost contact with their units, and units lost contact with each other. The Falaise pocket in August, where remnants of 2 German armies would be trapped and largely destroyed, was a direct consequence of the breakthrough at Saint-Lô. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in that encirclement. Those who escaped did so without their heavy equipment, their vehicles, and their artillery. They fled eastward as individuals and small groups rather than organized units. The liberation of Paris followed on August 25, just 1 month after the Cobra bombardment. French crowds celebrated in the streets as Allied forces entered the capital. The German garrisons surrendered after token resistance, their will to fight broken by the knowledge that the war in France was lost. By September, Allied forces stood at the German border. The strategic picture had been transformed in less than 6 weeks. What had seemed like an endless slog through the hedgerows had become a triumphant sweep across France. And it was all traceable to that single hour of destruction on July 25. The Panzer Lehr Division itself was reconstituted in the months that followed, rebuilt with replacements and surviving personnel, but it was never again the elite formation it had been. The men who had made it special, the veteran tankers and experienced infantry instructors, the sergeants and lieutenants who had embodied German military excellence, were dead or scattered across the hospitals of France and Germany. The replacements who filled its ranks were ordinary soldiers, conscripts pulled from shrinking manpower pools, trained for weeks rather than years. They wore the same uniforms and carried the same weapons, but they lacked the expertise that had distinguished the original division. Panzer Lehr would fight on until the end of the war, but it would fight as just another German division, not as the elite demonstration unit it had been created to be. Bayerlein continued in command through the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. He was relieved of command of Panzer Lehr in January 1945 after the division's failure to capture Bastogne. He was then given command of the Lii Corps and led it through the desperate defensive battles of early 1945, through the final disintegration of the German army in the spring. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945 in the Ruhr Pocket, one of the last senior German commanders to lay down his arms. After the war, Bayerlein cooperated extensively with American military historians, providing detailed accounts of German operations that remain valuable sources for scholars to this day. He attended conferences on the Normandy campaign, sharing his experiences with former enemies who had become colleagues in the study of military history. He died in Würzburg in 1970, having outlived most of his contemporaries from the Afrika Korps and the Normandy campaign. The bombardment of July 25, 1944 revealed truths about modern industrial warfare that military thinkers had long theorized but never witnessed on such a scale. The first truth was the overwhelming importance of firepower in determining battlefield outcomes. German soldiers at Panzer Lehr were not inferior troops. They were among the best trained and most experienced soldiers in the world. Their defeat was not a failure of courage or skill. It was simply that no amount of human quality could overcome the physical destruction that American industry could deliver. The second truth concerned the psychological dimension of such overwhelming force. Soldiers can adapt to danger when they believe their actions have meaning, when they feel that their training and courage give them some chance of survival. When that belief is shattered, when men learn that they are helpless before forces beyond their control, the psychological foundations of military effectiveness collapse entirely. The men of Panzer Lehr did not mutiny in the traditional sense of the word. They did not overthrow their officers or refuse orders as a collective act of rebellion. What happened was, in some ways, more significant. They ceased to function as soldiers. They could not fight, could not think clearly, and could not even understand what was happening around them. Their minds broke under a strain that no human being should have to endure. The third truth concerned the terrible price of such power, even for those who wield it. 111 Americans died under their own bombs on July 25. Lieutenant General McNair, one of the architects of American military victory, was killed by American weapons. The line between friend and enemy, between triumph and tragedy, proved razor-thin even in humanity's greatest demonstration of military power. Today, the fields west of Saint-Lô have long since healed from the wounds of 1944. The craters have been filled in by decades of farming. The hedgerows have regrown to mark the same ancient field boundaries they marked before the war. French farmers work land that was once a moonscape of destruction. Tourists drive along roads where tanks once battled. Few visitors to this quiet corner of Normandy understand what happened here in the summer of World War II. There is no dramatic memorial at the site of the bombardment, no museum dedicated to that single hour of destruction. The events of July 25 are remembered primarily in history books and military studies, analyzed by scholars seeking to understand the nature of modern warfare. The men who experienced it, both attackers and defenders, have passed away with the decades. But the lesson endures. As Bayerlein told von Kluge's representative in those bitter words, only the dead could hold the line, the survivors could not. They had been broken by forces that exceeded all human limits. The bombardment lasted 60 minutes. The Panzer Lehr Division died as an effective fighting force. The road to victory in Europe lay open at last. And the world glimpsed what industrial nations could do when they turned their full might to the business of destruction.